The Biden administration is acknowledging concern about Israel's potentially growing diplomatic isolation amid its latest spat with several European countries. Today, the leaders of Norway, Spain, and Ireland moved to recognize a Palestinian state in the coming days, calling it an important step toward peace.
Next Tuesday, on the 28th of May, Spain will approve its Council of Ministers the recognition of the State of Palestine.
This is an investment in the only solution that can bring lasting peace in the Middle East.
In the lead up to today's announcement, I've spoken with a number of other leaders and counterparts, and I'm confident that further countries will join us in taking this important step.
Earlier, the White House underscored President Biden's support for a two-state solution, but said that a, quote, Palestinian state should be realized through direct negotiations between the parties, not through unilateral recognition. CNN's Jeremy Diamond has been following the story live from Jerusalem for us. Jeremy, Israel is obviously condemning this move. What more can you tell us about the reaction there?
Yeah, the Israeli government not only condemning this move, but also taking the diplomatic step of recalling its ambassadors to Spain, Ireland, and Norway. The Israeli foreign minister also summoning those countries' ambassadors to Israel to the foreign ministry for a formal reprimand, saying even that he would make them watch video of Israeli women being kidnapped on October 7th. The Israeli prime minister, for his part, saying that recognizing a Palestinian state is tantamount to offering a reward for terror. And he's also making clear that he opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state altogether, saying that he believes a Palestinian state established today would be a quote-unquote terror state, something that obviously the Palestinian Authority and the countries that recognize the state of Palestine today very much disagree with. That's also a view very much at odds with the United States, which is seeking a two-state solution, hoping that this awful war that has unfolded in Gaza over the course of the last 7 months could potentially lead to a pathway to a two-state solution. Now, in terms of consequences, the Israeli foreign minister saying that there will be consequences for these countries, and its finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, a far-right member of Netanyahu's governing coalition, indicating that he will seek the approval of tens of thousands of housing units in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, establishing new settlements in the West Bank, and also he is pushing to withhold tax revenue, Palestinian tax revenue, which Israel collects, but that is meant to go to the Palestinian Authority, already cash-strapped. That could certainly be consequential. Overall, though, this move by these three countries, very much a symbolic step, but one that once again underscores Israel's growing isolation on the world stage.
Jeremy Diamond, live for us in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. Let's discuss all of this with Frank Lowenstein. He's a former special envoy to the Israeli-Palestinian negotiators. Thanks so much for being with us, Frank. This move by Spain, Norway, and Ireland, pledging to join more than 140 other nations recognizing Palestinian statehood. How do you see it?
Well, I think it's really a reflection of just how frustrated the world has become with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his unwillingness to move in the direction of a two-state solution. Norway in particular was interesting to me because they obviously brokered the Oslo Accords, which was the underlying agreement that governs the Israeli-Palestinian relationship right now. So they're obviously very invested in a negotiated outcome here. And for them to say, we're going to go ahead and recognize a Palestinian state in the absence of any negotiations suggests to me just an extreme amount of frustration that pervades really the United States and all around the world.
Is it ultimately just a symbolic move, though?
Yeah, it's entirely symbolic move. As Jeremy mentioned, there's been 140 countries have already recognized Palestine. I think the real question is whether this puts additional pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Israelis have a tendency to really close ranks and view the world as lined up against them, and they sort of consolidate their position around that. But there is increasing pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu from within his coalition to at least agree to some kind of a plan for the day after. And I think if Netanyahu continues to refuse to do that, we may very well see his coalition crumble, in which case you'd go to elections and you might have a very different sort of government in Israel.
I'm wondering how realistic you find the approach or the statement put out by the White House signaling their approach. They say that, well, President Biden is a strong supporter of a two-state solution, that ultimately a Palestinian state should be brought about through direct negotiations between the two parties. Is that a realistic goal? Is that likely to come about that way?
We're a long way away from that right now, and I think that's why you're seeing states unilaterally recognize Palestine. I think the Biden administration is really pushing this notion of a grand bargain where Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel in return for Israel agreeing to a pathway to a Palestinian state. I think there's been a lot of frustration with the Biden administration in terms of Prime Minister Netanyahu's unwillingness to even talk about a Palestinian state right now. So if you really want to make progress in that direction, you would have to have, I think, something like that gave the Israelis an incentive to change course that they don't feel like they currently have.
Yeah, I mean, let's break down that incentive for Netanyahu, because if he does broker this deal, this normalization with Saudi Arabia in exchange for the United States entering into this sort of pact with Saudi Arabia as part of like a trilateral agreement, you could call it, what's in it ultimately for Israel here?
Well, normalization with Saudi Arabia is the grand prize for the Israelis. And when I was working on this issue under President Obama, Prime Minister Netanyahu was adamant that that was what the ultimate goal was for Israel. Because with Saudi Arabia normalization comes normalization with the entire Arab world, which is the promise of the Arab Peace Initiative. So for Israel, this is the kind of thing that in the past they would have jumped on. I think the fact that they're not even willing to pretend that they're interested in a two-state solution is a function of Prime Minister Netanyahu's really extreme coalition and their unwillingness to do anything that would help the Palestinian Authority or let alone advance towards two states.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the CNN report yesterday that the ceasefire deal that Hamas agreed to earlier this month had been changed, that it had been altered by Egyptian intelligence after Israel had signed off on it, a moment that led U.S. officials, according to sources, to be embarrassed and enraged. How do you think this could happen?
Well, I think that the Egyptians and the Qataris are feeling an enormous amount of pressure to move towards a ceasefire. And I think they felt like they were really at a dead end there. And so they were willing to push it a little beyond what the Israelis had agreed to in order to get Hamas on board in hopes that they could get the Israelis on board. But I think the bigger question is, does Netanyahu want a ceasefire? Does Hamas want a ceasefire? And my sense is neither side really wants a ceasefire at this point. Bibi wants to continue the Rafah attack and otherwise prosecute the war to its conclusion, in his view. And I think Hamas thinks that Netanyahu is stepping into a trap in Rafah, and they're seeing all this isolation that Israel is experiencing and thinking that the war is going in their favor. So whatever may have happened specifically with the negotiations, I think the bigger picture is that neither side was really ready.
Frank Lowenstein, thanks for being with us.